on the board members' failures of the organization.
Abilities of both staff and board, and then certain pitfalls to avoid, especially when you are working with board members through the fundraising process. So if any of you have attended a CNDC presentation on board roles and responsibilities, you would have seen this slide. I'm not going to go through it all. The first one is ensuring adequate financial resources. In reality, that means fundraising. The second one is protecting assets and then providing financial oversight. That really is more on a governance side of things, making sure you have the policies and procedures in place to protect the resources, the financial resources of your organization. Obviously, all of those other things are really important too. Those really hone in on the board's role. When your organization is just starting out, you want content experts. You want individuals who bring substance to the work that your project is doing. Maybe they're content experts themselves. Maybe they work for an organization which focuses on the work that your project or your organization does, but you want them to be knowledgeable about what you're doing. Why is that important at that stage of an organization's growth? To solidify the work that you're doing, to have, right, to stabilize, to have proof that your organization is not just serious about what you want to do, but also to show that you can do it. You have some backing behind whatever program or service delivery you're doing. Any other thoughts on the role that board members play at that point? So those of you participating online, what Courtney just said is that in the earlier stages of development, board members are playing a more hands-on role. They might be actually putting the envelopes or putting the letters in the envelopes, looking them and sending them out, for example. Exactly right. Then as your organization grows through growth and the maturity stage, you're really looking for, yes, you still want those content or program experts. You still want those individuals who are heavily engaged in doing the work of the organization, but you want them also to be more entrepreneurial based, more true ambassadors of the organization. And by ambassadors, this next slide really kind of breaks it down. I'm going to start with this one here first. You want them to be organizational ambassadors and shift from the role of the mission and programming to a greater role focused on sustainability. So they can be a programmatic ambassador, they can be a service delivery ambassador, but as your organization grows, you want them to move from that sole focus to really an organizational ambassador focusing on the overall growth and sustainability of the organization. At the governance level, you want a board that's large enough, diverse enough, and skilled enough to ensure that the organization does have that stakeholder engagement and relationship. Now, large, diverse, and skilled is going to mean something very different from all of your organizations represented here. 10 might be a great board member number for one group. 6 might do it in another organization. 23 might be where you want to be at for another organization. So I'm not here to tell you this is the size your board needs to be. These are the skills you need to have on your board. This is the diversity that needs to be present. That's really going to look differently everywhere. But it is important to make sure you find that so that the responsibility is not just falling to the staff and or to one board member. Any thoughts on that? Okay. I'm going to ask one question, and then we're going to do a little exercise. So, where or what is the board's first involvement in fundraising? Approving budget. Any other thoughts on where a board first engages? All right, I like the response of personal gift because that's important, but Gosia hit the nail on the head. Why is approving the budget the very first place you want your board engaged? You have to know how much money you need, exactly. You have to know where it's going to come from, perfect. What else? If a board member, as a group, is approving the budget, you're making a commitment to do your part to raise those funds to implement those programs that your organization has said you're going to do. So absolutely, that's the very first part where board members should be engaged. You're absolutely right that that personal commitment comes next, and we want to emphasize that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But that first significant involvement comes at budget approval. Now, you might have board members who are more engaged in the actual development of the budget. That's great too. But as a whole, as a collective entity, you need that board to approve your budget. Okay, great. Now, what I'd like you to do, if you are, well, it doesn't matter who you're sitting next to. I'd like you to turn to a person next to you, and if someone could come up here and join Steve, that would be great. I want you to play one of two roles. Either speak about a cause that's important to you, talking about why that cause is important to you, how you support it, the importance, and then your initial engagement. And if you're not talking about that, then as the person listening, I only want you to ask questions about that person's cause or their engagement in the cause. Okay? Turn to the person next to you and go ahead and get started. Okay, so for those who are participating online, the response was that these two individuals did not talk about their current project work, but causes they're committed to or engaged in as a result of working in these two projects. Great. Other comments from people? Yes, Margaret. Formulating your elevator speech, explaining why it's important to you. That was a struggle. Okay, great. Anyone else? Yeah, absolutely. Being clear, concise, succinct about what you're trying to say, as well as hone in on what that person could be interested in and all of the areas of your work. And so that's important, and that focuses on a few things. One, if your board member's engaged in fundraising, if your staff is engaged in fundraising, which they should be, they need to have their elevator speech, right? They need to know how they're going to talk about the importance of the work that your organization does. Two, it focuses in on how do I tailor my elevator speech to the individual I'm talking to. You can do that initially by asking questions. That's why I wanted the other person who is listening just to ask questions. Oftentimes when we're engaged in an ask, whether that be face-to-face, one-on-one, or in writing a grant application or a concept note, things of that nature, we feel the pressure to guide the conversation to talk, right? We have to get all this information out there. And you're right, we do. But the best way to get to know the individual and what he or she wants out of their donation to your group is asking questions. That's not a one-time incident. That's a part of the relationship building process. And we'll talk about the donor cycle a little bit later. And that goes back again to the role of questions and how you can get at, that emotional connection that a donor might have or is developing or already has. And you can get at what they already know so that you can tailor your questions further and not talk as much. Okay, so keep these responses, keep these thoughts, reflections, questions that you didn't have the answers to in mind, especially when we talk about the support that board members do need when they're engaging in some aspect of fundraising. Okay, so we're just going to quickly review this. We've talked about the two initial methods of engagement, that budget approval and then personal commitment, okay? Board members should make a donation to your organization that is personally meaningful for them, hands down. Look in the Colorado Nonprofit Association's Principle and Practices, they'll say that. Google board member engagement and fundraising online, that's what you're gonna get. So hands down, that's the second area of initial method of engagement for your board members. Now then we get into well, let me talk about the facts up here. Okay, so in September 2012, the Nonprofit Research Collaborative did a study, a special report on engaging board members in fundraising. And they asked all these questions about board member engagement in fundraising to a variety of organizations. Of those organizations surveyed, 56%, only 56, required a contribution from each board member. 91% of that 56% talk to that board member about that requirement at the beginning of that board member's engagement. So that's pretty significant, that if you are going to require a commitment, a donation from your board members, that you let them know about that straight from the get-go. And then 35% of those 56% of organizations set a minimum requirement. Now let's talk about minimum requirements. Does any organization in the room set a minimum level of a donation from board members? Okay, why not? It varies per person. When I was recruiting board members for an organization, I had several board or prospective board members say, I want to be a part of your organization. I can't commit a lot of money. Like, that was an initial fear for them. They wanted to be a part, but they said, hey, I don't have money to give. No problem. We do require a contribution. Do what's meaningful for you. Let's work on other ways that you can be engaged in that fundraising process. I think most organizations in the room would expect fundraising engagement from board members, as well as some governance and programmatic engagement as well. Yeah. Okay, so 100% participation is a key measurement of board involvement. External donors are going to look for that. They're going to want to know how many people do you have on your board, how many of them have contributed. P2P, peer-to-peer, is that if you're requiring board members to contribute, then it should be board members ensuring that everyone is contributing on the board. That is not the staff's responsibility. They can support that. They can provide reports on who has contributed, who hasn't, but it's really the board's leadership, the chair, the vice chair, that leads that charge, right? So that's not the staff's responsibility. The staff can be part of that communication of that expectation, but it's really the board chair or another leadership position that encourages that contribution from other board members. What's interesting, again, also in that nonprofit collaborative research study that I talked about, and across other surveys, when you look at board giving, across all of these surveys about board giving, less than 10% of an organization's total philanthropic input is from board members. That shows you it's not about the amount, while that could be very much significant, don't get me wrong. It's not about the amount, but about total participation. And that's what's important. Okay, so these two methods of engagement, budget approval and personal donation, leads us to what I've classified as kind of the 4 other main areas of board engagement. From the little graphics on the screen, you can probably guess special events and grants, those are obvious, face-to-face or one-on-one, and then committee work. Don't feel limited by the number of board members you have on your board or on your particular committee. Bring in other volunteers for either a shorter period of time for a specific event. If they've had a good experience, there's your cultivation ground for future board members. The thing about face-to-face is obviously, people immediately think of this means I'm going to have to ask. And yes, that can be partially true, but it's also about this donor relations cycle. The ask is only one point in time. And there's so many different ways for board members to encourage that donor's participation or encourage that donor's feeling of being appreciated and thanks as well. Sponsorships is another great space. If board members have a particular business that they frequent a lot, makes it a lot easier to ask from that business if they're in there 3 or 4 times a week, for example. Perfect, great. Okay, now we're going to come over here and talk about committee. Are you talking about committee? Perfect. I'm going to come stand next to you. This list of prospects, categories, understanding who your donors are, why they give, that's a great role for a committee as well as for individual board members who are not comfortable doing that direct ask. Oftentimes the committee, a fund development committee, will work with staff, especially at the end of the year for annual giving campaigns, to say, here's our list of people who've received letters, let's divvy it up either by connection to individual board members or not, depending, but then really looking at that data and understanding it further. It's important to know who your donors are, why they're connected to your organization, their preferred method of contact, phone, email, They do like that annual fundraising letter at the end of the year. What was their last donation? Who had the last contact with them? And so that comment upon a donor database or some way to manage individual donors is important. For many of you, that can start off as an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be fancy. But as that individual donor base grows, you would want to think about investing further. That's an excellent point. Who has a former development director or current development director in your board? On your board. Think about development directors as great board members, whether current or former. Don't assume that they're going to do the ask for you, because that's what they do in their day job. But think about that skill set that a development director can bring and help you organize your committee, help you organize what we're going to talk next about a fundraising plan, things of that nature. So think about that person as a great potential board member. Again, not to do the work, but to help you structure the work. Bring them in for a short period of time, for example. Another thing a committee can do is talk about or develop giving levels. At $5,000, this is what your donation does. At $2,000, this is what your donation does. At $5, $10, $50, here's what your donation does. That can be a committee-led thing. That can obviously involve staff as well, but that's a way to get people involved in different ways in fundraising, other than feeling that pressure to do the ask. So, and you might have major donor giving levels and set your major donor level at $500 or $1,000 or up. And then you may have your standard individual donor levels, which may be smaller than that. So I want to talk about two things related to events, and project talk about it themselves since they're present in the room. But I will say I went to a project event on Saturday night. I was a solo attendee there from CNDC. I didn't have, someone attached to my hip or whatever. My husband didn't go with me, so I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people in attendance. And what I learned from talking to those individuals is that that event had lots of repeat customers. The event was attractive enough where they would come back year after year. That gives you your fundraising dollars from just that ticket purchase, right? The event was obviously valuable enough and interesting and enjoyable enough to make people come back year in and year out. The other thing I learned in talking to the people present there is that this project's board did an excellent job of communicating not just about the event, but about the project in general. So every single individual that I spoke to said, I'm here because my husband, my wife, my brother works with this board member, is neighbor to this board member, knows this board member. So that shows that that project's board is doing a very effective job, at least talking about the event, very specifically spreading the word about the organization. They're not necessarily doing that direct ask. In fact, for that event, they had an auctioneer come in to do the ask, not just for the silent auction, right? So think about that was one effective way that this one project effectively does it. Then just this morning, I also learned that they put a requirement on board to sell a certain number of tickets for the project's event. Some board members actually sold. Other board members who didn't sell then had to cough up the cash and purchase the tickets directly. So that's another method of engagement. As at an event, if you're asking for either participation in a paddle raise or to donate events, you can work with your donors who you know would give at that event and plant them in the audience. Plant them to say, hey, I'm going to give 5,000, I'm going to raise my hand here type sort of thing. Okay, so obviously that comes from long-term relationship building with your donors. You're not just going to go up to a person that you've just met and say, hey, can you, say I'm going to donate $5,000 at this event. But it also shows you that fundraising is strategic and it just doesn't necessarily well. The other thing I want to say about events is think about educational events or non-ask events, where you're talking about a general topic and educating attendees about that topic. Maternal health care, for example. Poverty among immigrant youth in Denver, for example. The need for X, Y, and Z, where your organization comes into play, but you're not specifically asking for those individuals to support. It's truly an educational event. That next step is to follow up with those individuals, get them hooked on your organization, and that's when the asking comes in. Okay, great, really good ideas, and we'll make sure all of that is communicated out to you after the project, or excuse me, after the training. Okay, so up on the screen, you see the title, Fundraising Plan, but then the text and the graphic here talks about committee support. Fundraising plan and committee. Notice over here, no one mentioned the committee's responsibility as leading the charge for having a fundraising plan at the organization. I got to tell you, plans are significant. The first one that's going out, it's a simple 2-pager. What I like about that one, and it's called Action Fundraising Plan for Main Street Shelter, for example. What I like about this one is that it shows how standard everyday communications are in fact a part of your overall fundraising plan. And so this type of plan, in addition to the other merits of it, just show you how regular communication is important by staying in touch with your donors. The second example, which is the one that has draft as a watermark on it, what I like about this plan is that it's very comprehensive. It shows you a history of what the organization has done in terms of meeting its goals, not meeting its goals. It breaks down information by individual donors. In fact, if you look on the top of the back of the first page, page 2, you see gift range charts for individual donors. It lists giving levels, and it gives the number of unique donors per those giving levels. This is obviously from an organization who has had an individual donor campaign and wants to build upon it, improve it. This particular plan also has recommendations. So to give you a little bit of background with this organization, they had just started a fund development committee. They'd never had one before. The committee's charge was to lead this effort and co-develop it with staff. So what this does is then includes recommendations on page 3, general recommendations, institute named giving levels, and then it proposes 3 different levels of giving to name your individual donor groups. So again, comprehensiveness and detail in this one. Then in this last one, and all these I'll send out after the training, so you could have templates and things like that. This particular one came from Compass Point, and in the resources that you'll find a link to this one as well as some other ones similar to it. What I like about this one is that it's quantifiable in the sense that it breaks down number of people asked, anticipated effectiveness of requests, estimated income. Then note it also incorporates board and staff role. I think that's pretty interesting when you think about who's going to be responsible for what. And what they've listed here is pretty spot on in terms of the breakdown between board and staff responsibilities. Just to emphasize a point we talked about earlier, number 3, board giving, in the board role column, it does say, make and honor donation pledge. Board chair, vice chair, lead effort to fulfill pledges. So again, I want to emphasize the importance of a plan being implemented through some type of committee, the dual role with board and staff, but that then also, 3 different fundraising plans, very, very different. So there's not one that's best, but a best practice in nonprofit is to have a fundraising plan that works for your organization. At its most basic, a fundraising plan is we're going to raise X through this amount, X with grants, X with events, and that's where you start. Okay, here are additional ways. Some of these came up in our discussions, but does your organization have an effective case statement? A case statement is in essence why anyone, any individual, any organization would want to donate to your organization and the impact that that donation has. At its most basic, that's what a case statement is. I could spend these entire 2 hours talking about how to write an effective case statement. And it's kind of your elevator speech. It goes back to what you talked about earlier. This is why this organization is important to me. This is why I give, and here's the impact that it has. And then under grants, that group mentioned the role that storytelling can play, either from a perspective of the board member's own personal commitment or by collecting stories, testimonials, beneficiary stories. Again, I'm going to use this event that I was at Saturday night just because it's fresh in my mind. There was one section right after the registration table that had pictures of the beneficiaries and thank you notes from them. The creation and collection of that is something that a board member could do on his or her own, right? But it also then communicated to the donors in the room why this work was so meaningful to the individuals who received these particular items. So it kind of serves two purposes. You can include personal commitment stories from board members into your annual fundraising appeals. You can include them in one-on-one asks. Further, with the beneficiary stories, same thing. If you get the board engaged, they're going to be more committed to the mission, and they're going to better effectively and more effectively communicate the meaning of the organization to potential donors as well. Again, all of these topics should be things that you should think about in terms of helping to prep your board members to do or working within your organization to help structure as well. And again, individual training topics in and of that. This is from Front Range Source. They're a group out of Boulder. You can subscribe to blog and newsletter, and then maybe once a week or every 2 weeks, they also send out what they call a fundraising roundup. And it's anything and everything that they've come across in that time period related to fundraising. Some of it is very specific to board engagement, but it's a great place just to get ideas from. So the next handout that you have comes from Front Range Source. The first one is a menu of options for board members to get involved, kind of in a funny, humorous sort of way, right? And one of them under the main course is give friends a tour of your organization's facility. Well, you may not bring them in to give them a tour of your office, but as Margaret said, she found it meaningful for a certain subset of her donors to take them to the jail and walk them through the experience that this organization does and how they engage in a particular institution. On the flip side of that is the document that I've been referring to, the cycle of donor relations. And this is so key because what this does is that certainly there's the ask, the solicitation here, but if you look at all these other areas where your board members can get involved, whether it's in the identification, like we've talked about here, lists of prospects and contact lists, whether it's qualification, that's where you get at asking your donors what you're interested in, why is this organization important to you, cultivation, more educational, keeping them in the loop, and then there's the acknowledgement and the stewardship part. This is key because if you have a board member who says, I'm not going to ask anyone for money, hands down, can't do it, not in my comfort zone, but I am happy to talk about the work that our organization does. Great. Bring them in either with a new donor that you're beginning to steward through your process, or on the tail end of the process or of this circular process, in terms of educating them about the impact that their donation had. A really great resource, again, also from Front Range Source. So if you have a board member who doesn't want to actively engage, the menu that I just handed out and things here are great ways to get them at least a foot in the door. Do they allow you to use their name when you're meeting with other individuals, right? Yes or no? Thank you notes. Have them write a thank you note to a donor. As a board member, I appreciated X, Y, and Z. This is what your donation goes to. Personalized on fundraising appeals. Usually it's the staff who pulls those together, provides information. Why not? Again, this goes back to your data and the work that your committee is going to do. Why not have your board members write either a personalized thank you or personalized request as a part of your annual ask campaign, things of that nature. That can be specific because the board member knows this group of 20 individuals, or it could be general as well. It really depends on how far you're breaking down your data. Obviously, list of prospect names or contact lists. They say, I'm not gonna ask, but I'll give you a list of 15 people I know who might be interested. And then think about time and experience. You might not have board members who are actively engaged, but they have time to give. Okay, so have them fold, all right? Have them host a pizza party with their kids and involve their family, for example. They can review existing donor lists. They can do data entry for you, okay? They might have a specific expertise in Excel, all right? Or they can do data entry really, really fast. They might know individuals in the technology sector who could work with you and help you find a better donor database as you build this individual donor campaign. So there's always ways to engage board members who are hesitant to ask. Obviously, you want a board member who's active in a variety of different ways. This again goes back to that one study, and it talks about different ways your board members gets involved. Notice how these small organizations, which they've ranked as less than 3 million, which is pretty big for a small organization if you ask me. Here's their list of 11 things that they asked nonprofits in terms of how they engage their board members. Notice on the smaller side, almost every single one is indicated. Personal visits, host event is not, send thank you, and rate prospects. Those are very easy ways to get your board members engaged, again, if they're not comfortable doing that face-to-face ask or engagement with the donor. Okay, reluctance to engage. On the screen, you'll see some of the top reasons why board members don't engage. In our conversations, we did talk about don't know how, I don't know the information, I don't know how to ask, I'm afraid to ask. I mean, who isn't afraid to ask for something, right? So it's your organization's responsibility to help your board members feel empowered to do this and find their comfort zone. So don't know how, afraid, never had to before. Wait a second, we pay staff an annual salary. Aren't they supposed to implement our fundraising? Yes, but in partnership with the board. I'm too busy, knowledge of need and goals, and training about it. I had proposed an exercise where we kind of sit down and role play a board member's reluctance. We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to skip over that. But think about that in terms of talking with your board members. What's their hesitation for engaging? And then what can you do as an organization to help them feel more comfortable engaging in the ways that they are? Has anyone heard another reluctance or objection to participating? And in those scenarios, it's important to validate that reluctance or hesitation. I get it, I understand. Then don't end the conversation there, take it one step further. Here's how we can get you engaged if you're not comfortable doing it in that way. Okay, culture of philanthropy. I think someone wrote that down back on the grant thing. And I want to read you a definition of culture of philanthropy. This is from another study that was done through Compass Point and a family foundation. What they did was that they analyzed organizations that had development directors. And in essence, this whole report talks about the instability of the role of the development director and how nonprofits could do a better job of engaging not just development directors, but their board in general in fundraising. And so one of the first things that this study talks about is the culture of philanthropy. Their definition is, while familiar to fundraising professionals, the term culture of philanthropy is not yet well understood nor commonly used across the sector. Not to be confused with institutional grant making or the act of giving money as a donor, a culture of philanthropy refers to a set of organizational values and practices that support and nurture development within a nonprofit organization. It's not about the actual ask. It's about ensuring that your organization puts this at the forefront of the work that you're going to do, and then takes that next step to actually implement what it is that you need to do an effective job. That can be something as simple as training your board members, right? That could be something as simple as, we don't have a donor database yet, we don't need one yet, but let's work on getting a really solid Excel spreadsheet together for us. That's what the culture of philanthropy is all about. Fund development is valued, staff and board are deeply engaged, and you can do that through your position descriptions. You can do that through board member agreements. You know, the sample board member agreement that I think CNDC uses and offers up as a template to other organizations to use encourages 3 parts of fundraising in that one board member agreement: their own donation, active engagement in fundraising activities, and then obviously the program and fiscal stewardship. So it's putting in place policies and practices that help you do it. The last one listed on that screen has to do with a personal commitment form for board members. What this does is this takes kind of that board member agreement one step further, where in the recruitment process, you've made it very clear that a personal donation is required. And so this spells it out even in more detail about how an individual could be engaged in fundraising. Now, this may seem like a lot to give to your board members. Well, great, don't use it in its entirety. Take what works for your organization, where you're at now, and then gently push and move your organization along. Okay, so part of culture of philanthropy is ensuring that your organization invests in the fundraising capacity. Many organizations hired an executive director or project director because they're effective in what they do. They know how to manage budgets, they know how to supervise staff, they know how to implement the programs that they're doing. Many effective EDs or project directors aren't comfortable fundraising, and that's okay. But as a board, you should encourage that aspect of professional development in your executive director. Maybe it's introducing them to a person who is an effective fundraiser. And so it's a mentor-mentee relationship. Maybe it's investing $500 to send them to a training, a grant writing workshop. Who knows? Flipping it, your board members need that support too. Make sure your board has that support that they need. A plan is a great way to do it, a database, some sort of capacity to carry out activities. Meaning, if the organization is going to grow to be a sustainable organization, it may require the executive director to take a step back from program delivery to focus on fundraising. Understanding needs and goals, meaning what does the organization need? What do individuals who are active in fundraising, what do they need? And then a focus on goals. Clarity of roles, which is on the next screen, or one around, I guess. Okay, so turning it around, how many of you actually talk to your board members before you ask them to be engaged in fundraising?
What do you mean?
Well, when I was a new executive director, I had one-on-ones with each of my board members. I got to know more than how long they'd been engaged, but why was it important, the different roles that they've served. And then one of my last questions was, where do you want to participate in the fundraising process? Because then you understand their comfort levels. And you know this person, at least in this first year, is never going to do an ask. Okay, I get it. But you know what? Their sister, husband has a family foundation, and they're going to facilitate that $25,000 a year donation to your organization. So understanding comfort levels for your board members, understanding what you can do to help them have more comfort levels in fundraising is pretty important in that process. That's a key staff role, knowing your board members and what they're going to be comfortable doing and how you can help them do a better job. All right, staff needs to arm their board members with information, whether it be talking points about the organization, whether it be the current budget. You know, our organization's budget has grown from X to Y in the past 3 years. What have we done with that money? We've implemented these 3 new programs. What do individual programs cost? So a donor knows how far their donation would go to funding that particular program. Even if it is staff salary. That's a great thing to fund. So then the board member should talk about how effective the executive director or project director is in doing X, Y, and Z. Here are our current donors. Here's our current funding level. Here's the gap. Here's what we're trying to bridge between. Outcomes. here's the impact our organization has had. And to be truly effective, you need to talk about the successes your organization has had, as well as those challenges. We know we can do better in X, Y, and Z. We've identified A, B, and C as how we're going to do it better. We need your support to do it better. Same thing applies in grant application. When you think about training your board members or training staff, it's not about asking, it's really about relationship building. So that's the emphasis. And in some of the handouts that I'll send you after it, there's one article that really focuses on the downfall of many fundraising trainings. It's because it always focuses on the ask. Now, granted, there is a bit of a science to what many fundraising professionals call the arc of the ask, and you can give training to your board members about how to structure an ask conversation. But as we talked about, and as you saw earlier in the training, it's really about asking the questions which lead to the ask, rather than really doing the ask. I think it's always better when you're asking for money to be transparent about your organization. And there's nothing wrong with saying, we have received less funding from these donors, particular foundations, for example, because of this. Or, as you know, in the current political climate, this is happening. That has impacted us in this way. You know, you can call it a sympathy ask, but it's really being realistic about your funding landscape, and then that you're aware of it and what you're doing to overcome those things. Okay, so some additional facts. I know we're right at the time frame, so I do want to wrap up. When board members were asked to make requests, the organizations more frequently met their goals than organizations who did not ask their board members to be engaged in the fundraising process. And then, especially among smaller groups, the most successful methods allowed nonprofits to expand their pool of potential donors, meaning what was found to be most effective was asking board members to expand the pool of potential donors rather than doing that direct ask. But again, you want them engaged in different ways. Okay, staff and board roles really focused on that culture of philanthropy, as we've talked about, really ensuring that everybody needs to be accountable, staff and board alike. As a staffer, you want your board to be donors. You want them to be visionaries. You want them to have a plan for growth and success for the organization, especially that board chair, if you've identified one. You want them to be ambassadors for the organization, meaning you want them out there talking about it, not just from a program level. And then they're going to support the staff in a fundraising effort. Again, that's where you pull your committee in, your chair of that committee, or the fundraising committee members. And here's your staff roles. The staff really needs to be the one providing the motivation for this, encouraging your board members, being supportive of each and every way a board member engages in the process. Staff members can help their board members by identifying their strengths and being very specific. If you have a new board member, don't dump them out there, don't leave them alone to drown or whatever. Start small, arm them with the resources that they need, get them engaged on a committee, and then move them forward in the process. Staff needs to be knowledgeable, not just about the fundraising process, but also about the things that your organization needs to have in place to help your board members effectively engage in fundraising from a knowledge perspective, as well as from that fundraising perspective. So do we have a donor database? How many individual donors do we have? I've heard some of those questions come up in your conversation. Your board members need to know that information as well. Okay, anything else? My apologies for kind of rushing through the last few sections. But here are some things to not do in the process. Fundraising is not just once a year. It doesn't happen in the month of December. You don't just rely on your staff to do it. You don't just rely on your board to do it. And the fourth bullet point up there is a pretty important point to make. Putting a board member first. Maybe you have a board member who refuses to engage in X, Y, and Z methods. Maybe they've been a board member for a really, really, really long time. What's most important to your organization? Having that board member stay on, or perhaps encouraging that board member to rotate off. Now, I'm not saying get rid of a board member who isn't going to engage in fundraising, because that board member may be important to the organization in another way. But oftentimes we let our emotions get in the way, and what we need to do is put the organization first. So don't leave here saying, well, Emily said I should get rid of this person because he or she didn't ask, the X, Y, and Z for the money. That's not what I'm saying. But do consider what your organization needs. And then never put your board member, never put your staff in a position where they're just not ready for it, or where it's truly not anywhere possible in their comfort zone. And I'll leave you with that. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to talk to people one-on-one afterwards, but we are at the time, so thank you very much for coming, and have a great afternoon.